With the relative speed at which it forms and the vast areas that it covers, it's perhaps no surprise that countless objects, animals, and areas have been completely consumed by ice. And now, especially as the planet is beginning to warm up, ice sheets around the world are starting to recede, revealing secrets that were once covered. Here are the top 15 most incredible frozen discoveries. Number 15. Yuka the mammoth. Woolly mammoths are some of the more well-known species of animal that lived during the last ice age, and surprisingly they lived side by side with humans and were still around in some regions at the same time that the Egyptians were building pyramids. Despite this, very little is truly known about their lives and their physiology, but the fact that they tended to live in frozen regions means that some individuals were almost perfectly preserved within an ice sheet. In 2010, tusk hunters working in Siberia discovered what's regarded as the best preserved mammoth to have ever been found, a juvenile female that was named Yuka after the nearest town where she was discovered. When she was first seen, she was entombed within a 13-foot ledge that was hanging out over a beach, and to remove her from the ice, researchers kept her and a block of ice that had been cut free around her in a refrigerator that they used to warm up over a period of several years. Subsequent analysis has found that she was just 7 years old when she died, with the most likely cause being that she was being chased by predators such as wolves and fell into a pond as she tried to make her escape. Number 14. The Glacier Girl. In July of 1942, as unusually unfavorable weather conditions began to move in, 6 P-38 aircraft and 2 B-17 bombers were forced to turn around to land in Greenland instead of continuing on to their destination in the UK. They all made emergency landings on an ice field, and while all the crew members were rescued, the aircraft were stuck in the ice and eventually became buried underneath 268 feet of snow. After many years of searching, the Greenland Expedition Society finally managed to locate where the aircraft were in 1992 and began the process of retrieving one of the P-38s, which would become known as the Glacier Girl. It was remarkably well preserved and was soon sent to Middlesboro, Kentucky, where it underwent significant restoration that was amazingly able to restore it to flying condition. With the glacier where it was found now drifting towards the sea, experts have managed to locate one of the other P-38s and are hoping to be able to retrieve it too. Currently, the position is too dangerous to try to attempt this, and it's possible that the Glacier Girl will be the only one that's ever pulled out of their frozen landing place. Number 13. Meteorites. Meteorites are continuously falling down onto our planet all around us, but normally, when they crash into fields or forests, they're soon covered by the ground, which makes them extremely difficult to locate. That's not the case on ice capes like those found in the Antarctic, though, because the scars they leave on the surface act as markers to where they finally rested. And this means that the frozen continent is one of the best places for meteorite hunters to go in search of pieces of space rock. What makes Antarctica even more suited to this work is that the surface is always moving, albeit very slowly, and if you chart the ice flow, you can predict certain locations where most material is deposited. Meteorites have fallen over hundreds of thousands of years and are therefore concentrated in these regions, and it's often simply a case of scouring the surface to pick them up. A team that visited in 2018, for example, managed to collect 250 samples in just a couple of days by using this technique, and this is by no means an extraordinarily large haul. The U.S. Antarctic Meteorite Program has to date collected upwards of 22,000 meteorites, which represent the largest collection in the world, and features some that originated on the Moon, Mars, and from passing asteroids. Number 12. A mountain range. Of all the geographical structures that develop on our planet, arguably the easiest to spot are the mountains. Reaching huge heights above the landscape, they're visible from all directions and are a clear hurdle to pass if you're traveling by land. But it might surprise you to know that there's a mountain range approximately the same size as the European Alps that remain hidden and was first only discovered in 1958. Known as the Gamburtsev Range, it's 750 miles long and has peaks that reach up to 8,900 feet. It's located in eastern Antarctica, though, and one of the reasons why it wasn't so clear that it existed is that the entire range is covered with snow and ice that's up to 2,000 feet deep. It's thought the mountains, as they currently are, must have formed about 34 million years ago, before the region began being covered with ice, and that the eastern Antarctic ice sheet began life as glaciers that formed on the Gamburtsev Mountains. The structure of the range, though, is believed to be much, much older, and researchers have detected evidence that their initial formation can be traced back to 1 billion years ago, making them potentially the oldest mountain range on the planet. Despite all we know of them, no one has actually seen the mountains for themselves because they're still buried beneath the ice and snow, and it's only the use of modern technology that allows us to map and predict what they look like. Number 11. Grasshoppers. In the Beartooth Mountains of Montana, there's a glacier like none other. At 1/5 of a mile long and 1/4 mile wide, it's tiny compared to other well-established glaciers, and this is mainly because it's receded so significantly in recent decades. What this movement has done, however, is reveal things that have been captured in the ice over millennia. And in the case of this glacier, the main thing that emerges are grasshoppers, and lots of them. In fact, tens of millions of them have been found within the ice, some of which are species that existed thousands of years ago and are now long extinct. Many specimens have been so well preserved that they've enabled researchers to understand ancient grasshoppers far more than has been possible by studying remains elsewhere, and it's significantly improved the understanding of local species. As for how this happened in the first place, it's thought that swarms of grasshoppers that can contain billions of individuals naturally travel across the area. Occasionally, though, they get caught in storms and die, and their bodies would fall onto the glacier and quickly be covered by a layer of snow to preserve them. Interestingly, this hasn't happened at anywhere near the same rate in recent years because of the receding of the glacier and reduced snowfall due to climate change, and the last time a swarm was trapped there on a large scale is thought to have been in the 1980s. Number 10. 1,000-year-old forest. Mendenhall Glacier is a huge 13-mile-long piece of ice within the Mendenhall Valley, which is in southeastern Alaska, and it's known for its stunning scenery and incredibly beautiful ice caves that are sometimes accessible due to melting near its base. It has, however, been in retreat for almost a century and is 1 3/4 miles shorter than it was in 1929, and this has revealed some interesting things. In 2012, it was noticed that tree stumps, logs, and wood with roots still attached to them were emerging from within the ice, and they're still in their original growth position. The trees are of course dead and have been dated back to between 1,500 and 2,500 years ago, which not only sheds light on the type of species that were prevalent in the area at that time, but also how surprisingly recent the glacier itself had covered them. While it's cause for concern that glaciers like this are retreating, it's discoveries such as this forest that shows how glaciers are constantly growing and retreating, and that there's no reason why Mendenhall Glacier won't once again cover as vast an area as it once did. Number 9. HMS Terror. HMS Terror was originally built in 1813 for the British Royal Navy as a state-of-the-art warship and was used in the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States. Within 20 years, however, there were far more effective ships that had been brought into service, so the Terror was refitted for polar exploration. The ship was part of the Ross expedition between 1839 and 1843, but met its end along with the HMS Erebus in 1845. During this trip, the crew had been trying to make the first full crossing of the Northwest Passage and at the same time gather magnetic data of the region. Things went terribly wrong, however, and both ships became stuck within the ice and eventually sank, while the crew were forced to try to fend for themselves after abandoning ship, and all of them ultimately died. It would be another 170 years until the wreck of the HMS Terror would be found at King William Island in Terror Bay at a depth of around 75 feet. The discovery was the result of a concerted effort by Parks Canada that organized a research vessel to break through the ice in search of the lost ships. Both the Terror and the Erebus were found, and because they had spent so long stuck in ice and freezing water, they were in remarkable condition. Further explorations of the secret location of the ships are planned over the next few years, and it's hoped that the written journals of the ship's captain, along with objects from the time, will have been preserved too, and will eventually be retrieved as important historical artifacts. Number 8. Photo negatives. At the beginning of the 20th century, a number of different expeditions went to Antarctica with various goals in mind. Some wanted to reach the South Pole, others wanted to chart the continent to claim land for their home countries. But no matter why they had gone there, they all needed shelter and refuge to protect themselves against the harsh environment. It's for this reason that several exploration huts were built and still remain there to this day. Of course, they're primitive compared to today's standards and aren't used by explorers anymore, and in 2014 a team from the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust embarked on a mission to restore some of the huts as historical monuments. While they were doing this to one of Captain Scott's huts, they found a block of ice which had contained within it a box of 22 cellulose nitrate negatives that had been taken by explorers on the continent. After meticulous restoration and processing, the images were finally retrieved from the negatives and are now a remarkable insight into what it was like to explore the frozen continent more than a century ago. Thought to have been taken during Ernest Shackleton's Ross Sea Party expedition between 1914 and 17, the trip itself ended in disaster with the loss of the boat and 3 members of the crew, but the images had proven to be an invaluable record of what the ice sheets looked like back then and can be compared to how different they are today. Number 7. Viruses. In many ways, the objects and regions trapped beneath thick layers of ice give researchers a way to look directly back into the past. But there are occasionally discoveries that act as a reminder of how carefully such exploration should be, because of the potential risks involved. In 2015, a team of scientists went to the Glacial ice cap in Tibet in order to study some of the oldest ice in the world. And while their intent was to take a look at the effects of climate change and how it has fluctuated throughout our planet's history, they made another surprising find, a series of viruses that were at least 15,000 years old. Of those that they found and were able to grow in laboratory conditions, 28 groups were completely new to science and represent those that would have been present in the atmosphere at the time. Luckily, on this occasion, none were deemed to be a risk to human health, but it's quite possible that somewhere out there's a virus hidden within the ice that could prove to be deadly and comes from a time before our earliest ancestors were around, meaning we'd likely have no natural defenses whatsoever. Number 6. Secret Nazi Base. It's long been known that during the Second World War, Hitler sent a team of researchers to Antarctica in search of mythical animals, and while the theories of Nazis setting up a base on the frozen continent have so far proven to be unfounded, that's not the case with the North Pole. In 2016, a Russian group of scientists were working on Alexandra Land for the first time in almost 40 years, which is one of the Franz Josef land islands in the Barents Sea that are normally covered in a layer of ice. During a few weeks of the summer, however, the ice melts, and on this occasion the researchers were there at just the right time to rediscover the remains of a secret Nazi outpost that had been built there. Known as the Schatzgraber, or treasure hunter, it was a weather station that had been built by German soldiers in 1943, and among the items left behind were rifles, machine guns, landmines, and hand grenades. 10 meteorologists were based there when it was in operation, and it formed part of a larger network across the Arctic that the Nazis used to predict weather patterns across northern Europe, in the hope that it would give them the edge over their enemy. Eventually, though, they were abandoned, and the people who worked there were evacuated by submarine, only being able to take the most important things with them. In the cold tundra, everything had been very well preserved, and there were more than 600 items in total, including shoes, clothes, books, documents, military plans, and even a copy of Tom Sawyer. Number 5. McKinley Whiskey. In 2010, conservationists were attempting to renovate a hut in Cape Royds, Antarctica, that had been used by Ernest Shackleton on several trips to the frozen continent. But when they took a look beneath the structure's floorboards, they found the one thing that anyone in such a frozen environment would want: several crates of whiskey. The crates were frozen solid after having been there for more than a century, but even at sub-zero temperatures, the alcohol itself hadn't frozen, and they could hear it sloshing around inside. Amazingly, the team that found them resisted the temptation to try the McKinley whiskey, which had been bottled in Scotland in 1898, and instead was taken back with them to New Zealand. Upon hearing about the find, the company that now owns the McKinley brand chartered a private jet from New Zealand to take the bottles back to Scotland so they could recreate the whiskey. The recipe had long been lost, but by removing some with a syringe through the cork, they were able to create a limited edition batch of 50,000 bottles that were sold to raise funds for the Antarctic Conservation Mission. As for what happened to the original bottles, they were taken back to the hut where they were to remain as a memorial to the golden age of Antarctic explorations. Number 4. The Pegasus plane crash site. In October of 1970, a C-121 Lockheed Constellation plane called the Pegasus was flying over Antarctica with more than 80 people on board, heading towards a research station, when they encountered a problem. The notoriously bad weather in the region had whipped up an almighty storm, but the pilots had no choice but to proceed because they knew they didn't have enough fuel to return to New Zealand where they had come from. With a sense of inevitability, visibility was reduced to virtually nothing. The wind and shards of ice began to rip pieces of metalwork from the body of the plane, and it crash-landed into the ice. Amazingly, no one on board was seriously harmed, and they were all rescued and able to continue on with the research that they had traveled there to carry out. The plane, however, was a complete wreck and was covered by a blanket of snow, and for a few years it was completely forgotten about. Things on the surface of Antarctica rapidly changed, however, with the snow continuously falling and melting. The noticeable orange coloration of the plane's rear section soon re-emerged from its icy tomb. Located close to the McMurdo Research Station, it has now become a popular trip for people spending time there, and sure makes for one of the most unusual selfies you could ever possibly take. Number 3. Dinosaur fossils. As Antarctica hasn't always been a frozen wilderness and was once covered in thick forests and vegetation, it was also home to a number of species of dinosaurs, and the ground can be just as much a wealth of fossils as anywhere else in the world, although of course they can be more difficult to access because of the freezing temperatures. In May of 2016, researchers announced an incredible discovery. They had found more than a ton of prehistoric fossils that dated back between 71 and 67 million years ago. They were found beneath the melted ice on Ross Island, which is between Chile and Antarctica, and were from a variety of species of reptiles and birds, although a large proportion were from mosasaurs. What was particularly interesting about this find is that the remains were from a time very close to the mass extinction that wiped out most life on the planet, and it's possible that by studying them, further clues can be found out exactly why they all died out, and the environmental changes they had to endure before becoming extinct. The find was so substantial that further trips to the island are planned to see what else is there, and researchers also hope to plan trips to the coastal regions of Antarctica itself, because it's likely to be a source of countless never-before-seen species buried beneath the ice. Number 2. Sacrifice victims. In 1999, a team of explorers were climbing the Yuka volcano in Argentina when they made a particularly horrifying discovery. They uncovered what happened to be a shrine, and within it were the mummified remains of 3 children. Later dated to around 500 years ago, there was a 13-year-old girl, along with a younger boy and a girl who were thought to have been no more than 5 years old. And this began the job of solving the mystery of how it was possible they had come to be there. Originally thought to have succumbed to the elements as they traveled across the mountain range with their family, recent tests have revealed a more gruesome reason. All 3 were the victims of a ritual Incan sacrifice, whereby they had been fed alcohol and cocoa leaves, which were used to make cocaine, for several weeks before their deaths. So they would have been out of their minds by the time they were led to the tombs and left there to die. It's likely they would have passed away quite quickly and peacefully and wouldn't have realized what was happening to them. But it is a fascinating insight into Incan beliefs. Number 1. Box of Jewels. In 2013, a French mountain climber found a remarkable discovery in the thawing snow of Mont Blanc. And when he walked into the local police station to report what he had found, no one could believe their eyes. In his hand was a metal case with the inscription, "Made in India," and inside were sapphires, emeralds, and rubies that were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. You might think that this find would be completely unexpected, and virtually anywhere else in the world it certainly would have been. But locals familiar with the mountain are very aware of Indian relics that periodically appear in the region, and each time they bring back memories of a terrible accident that happened in 1966. That was the year that Air India's Boeing 707 flight to New York via Geneva and London crashed into the mountain, supposedly as a result of faulty instruments that made the pilots miscalculate their altitude and crash into the mountain's peak. There were no survivors, and debris was scattered all around and quickly covered with snow. Every now and then the snow will melt or move and reveal another artifact from the flight, but this one has been by far the most valuable. Watch our Obscure playlist for more top 15 videos about the more obscure subjects in our world. Sit back, relax, and binge watch all of our best and most obscure videos.